All right, gentlemen, let's talk about one of the original old-school role-playing games, one of the first, probably the second computer role-playing game ever written. This is Daniel Lawrence's D&D, although this is a later DOS version by RO Software. In this game, you murder hobo your way down into the bottom of a dungeon to fetch a MacGuffin called the Orb, which supposedly gives you immortality, but not until you get out of the dungeon. And then you murder hobo your way back out, which is the best way to play D&D. The original version was written in Basic +2, I think, on a PDP-10 running TOPS 10 by Daniel M. Lawrence in 1976. Later it was also ported to VMS Basic, VMS Pascal, DOS, using that same Pascal source code, and later to C in Unix. And it has also given rise to a few derivatives and fanworks, which we'll talk about later. So, the idea, there's some claims circulating around the internet that this was the first computer role-playing game, which is probably incorrect. I think that idea comes from an incorrectly sourced and cited internet article claiming that the game was written in 1972. I remember reading that article years ago, but I can't find it now, so I don't know exactly what the deal is. But that's kind of amusing in a way, because the original tabletop version of D&D, upon which this game is obviously heavily based, didn't come out until 1974. The reason I think this is probably the second computer RPG is that there was an earlier game also called D&D on the Plato system, which was written in 1974 by Flint and Dirk Pellet, and then was later expanded by Gary Wisenhunt and Ray Wood. And there was a whole lot of drama back in the day around which of these was first and which wasn't, and I don't really give a fuck about the drama, but I'll try to go over it here just for historical nerdery or something, I guess. So, the earliest date that I can find in any of the extant source files for Lawrence's game, the one that we're talking about, is 1976. Lawrence's games share some obvious similarities with the Plato D&D game in that the UI is somewhat similar, and the MacGuffin of going into the dungeon to collect the Orb of Immortality is the same, but Lawrence's version uses entirely different maps and mechanics from the Plato D&D game. So, in my opinion, Lawrence's D&D, the one that we're talking about, is obviously inspired by the earlier Plato D&D, but I don't think we can consider it a copy or even a theft, per se, any more than we can consider, like, a Chevy to be a copy of a Ford, or Westwood's Eye of the Beholder game to be a copy of FTL's Dungeon Master. They're similar in presentation, but they are, and in their ideas, their basic ideas, but they're very different in content. So, in any case, it's ancient history at this point, and I'm interested in preserving, playing, and improving the game. I do credit Plato D&D as the earlier game. I think that makes the most sense. That it was the inspiration for Lawrence's version of the game, but beyond that, I got tired of the dick waving about it back in the day, and I'm still tired of the dick waving about it, so please, I don't want to hear it if you're one of those guys. Sorry. If you're interested in trying the Plato version of D&D, that's Plato, not Play-Doh, it can still be played on the Cyber 1 Plato system, at least the last time I tried it, which was probably 10 or 15 years ago, but I assume it's still up there. So all of this drama about theft is kind of amusing to me anyway, because, I mean, the only reason the game is remembered today is because of the DOS version. which was borrowed from the VMS Pascal version, which itself was borrowed from Lawrence's basic version, which itself was inspired by the Plato version, which generated all the drama and shit. But the Plato version itself appears to be borrowing a huge amount of shit without permission from TSR's tabletop D&D game. So again, I don't want to hear it. So, let's just leave all of that dumb fuckery behind us and focus on the preservation and improvement and history of this particular branch of the game. Alright. So, Dan Lawrence was originally from Arizona, I think. He died of a heart attack in 2010, so we can't ask his opinion on all of that bullshit. At the ripe old age of 52, he wasn't a very old man. I think he had some weight problems. And at the time he lived in Lafayette, Indiana. He was an avid, like, hardcore D&D player. Apparently he had this, like, D&D house, and people just were over there all of the time playing tabletop role-playing games like night and day all the time or something like that. He attended Purdue University in the mid-70s, which is likely where he was exposed to the Plato system and the original Plato version of D&D. But he is better known actually for the later game called Telengard, another RPG that you may have heard of for 8-bit microcomputers. But in my opinion, D&D, this game, is the superior game because the dungeon designs are more interesting instead of being completely random like in Telengard. So the original version of the game was, I think, written on TOPS 10. That was an operating system for the DEC 10 mainframe. I think in BASIC +2, probably while he was at Purdue, but I'm not sure about that. Lawrence later went on to work for DEC, where he ported the game to VMS Basic. And then he left DEC, but the source code stayed there, and several DEC employees, I don't remember the names off the top of my head. I've got a whole email thread, well, it's pre-email, a DEC mail thread about it in the Subversion archives. So we can look that up if you're interested. But some DEC employees later, possibly assisted by Lawrence, maybe, I don't know for sure, later ported the game to Pascal and apparently made massive improvements to it, but what those improvements are unknown because none of the Pascal source survives. Around this time, after Lawrence had left DEC, I think it was after he left DEC, he wrote that aforementioned 8-bit Telengard game on the Commodore PET in BASIC, and began negotiating with Avalon Hill to publish it. And as part of these negotiations, apparently, he made some legal rumblings which forced DEC to remove the D&D game from all of their systems. But fortunately, this guideline was only very loosely followed, and the game survived, because later, a contractor at DEC by the name of Bill Knight got a hold of the Pascal source code while he was working as a contractor there, and he ported it to the IBM PC. And that's the version that you're seeing playing here, because I couldn't get the Unix version to compile. The last time I tried to compile it on Linux was, I don't know, it could be as many as, no, it wasn't 20 years ago, it was probably 10 or 15, but it used to compile on Linux with just a couple of minor changes, but I can't get it to run now on a Dev1 series system, so I don't know what's up with that, but I didn't want to take the time to fart around with it. It runs, but there's something wrong with the reading and writing of the player file. You can't create characters and enter the dungeon, but I'll fix it, and we'll see what's going on there here at some point. Anyway. A controversial thing, though, Bill Knight released his port of D&D as shareware through his company RO Software, much to the consternation of the DEC employees who had largely written it. So, once again, there was more who stole the code from who dick-waving. Which, in my opinion, this dick waving was probably a little more justified than the previous dick waving. However, there are no copyright notices in any of the source code that I've looked at, and that was a different day. That was software. A lot of software back then was just kind of, you wrote it and you gave it to your buddies, and it was just kind of assumed to be in the public domain. At least that's how it was on the Apple II back in the day. Anyway, sometime later, mid 80s, I think, Knight rewrote the entire game, again in Pascal, and re-released it as Dungeons of the Necromancer's Domain. Still D&D, but not D&D, so as to not get in trouble with TSR, I suppose. This version of the game had entirely different dungeons, even though the mechanics were, as far as I can tell, the same, but I don't think the dungeons, his new dungeons, are nearly as well put together as the dungeons that came from the VMS version that were used in earlier versions of PC D&D. And once you see the extant source code, you will understand why Bill Knight decided to rewrite the entire game, because it is... The source code that we've got is the shit from which nightmares are made, buddy. It is scary. So anyway, like I said, none of the Pascal source code has survived. The only extant source code we've got comes from a fellow named Chuck Cranor, who backported the 3.0 VMS basic version of the game back to TOPS 10 while he was in high school. That was a computer they had at his high school, apparently. And then later, when he was in college, he ported his already ported version to C. And we have the sources of that original VMS Basic 3 version. We have the sources for Cranor's backport to TOPS 10, but not the original TOPS 10 source code. And we have the source code to Cranor's Unix port. And, yeah, it used to compile under Linux, the Unix version, but something's wrong. It doesn't anymore. I'll fix it. I'll check it into the Subversion repository, and then you can try the older version that way, I guess, if you want. So anyway, yes, there were also some derivative fan works. There were several for several ancient platforms. There's a tripod website mirror, again in the Subversion repository, that gives a lot of details on those, but I'll hit the highlights. Justin Rancourt, the guy who used to run that tripod website, partially completed a very interesting fan work called Return to the Necromancer's Domain, which is, pardon me, which in my opinion is very well made, but it's not quite finished. It's included in that Subversion repository, and I've included it there without his permission because I can't figure out how to get in contact with him, and I figure at this point, hopefully he doesn't care. Justin, if you watch this, send me a message, and we can hook up or something. Alright, there's also a guy named Steve Segreto, is a guy, I've actually been in contact with him. He wrote a very nice fan work called AD&D, Another D&D, which later he renamed to The Valley of Neustria. And that Valley of Neustria game eventually morphed into a 3D game that no longer uses any of the original D&D dungeon maps or mechanics or gameplay style at all, as far as I can tell. So I've gotten Steve's permission to reproduce his D&D related games in the Subversion repository that accompanies these videos. It's linked to in the video description, but for his later work, he has a YouTube channel, which I'll also link down there if you want to see what he's been doing more recently, and by recently I mean like 2009 or something like that. And anyway, yeah, we'll examine some of these derivatives a little more closely in later videos, but I don't want to waste too much time on that because, oh, we have already wasted plenty of time, haven't we? So, speaking of mechanics and gameplay, we might consider this to be an early roguelike game, although it predates Rogue, and it differs a good bit from what we'd call these days the traditional roguelike. For one, all of the dungeons in this game were designed by actual humans, and they're fairly static, completely static. I mean, sometimes things change, but when you leave the dungeon level and go back, everything becomes the same again. Rather than random like we see in most roguelikes. So this, in my opinion, makes the dungeons more interesting because they have this like intelligent sort of design to them rather than just being a chaotic jumble of locations. And secondly, the user interface for D&D is all context sensitive and prompts the player rather helpfully. Like when you start a fight with a monster, you get a menu of actions to fight or cast or flee. When you interact with a dungeon feature, you get a menu of actions specific to that dungeon feature. Drink out of the fountain or ignore it, or take the stairs or ignore them, or push certain buttons on a thingamajig or whatever. You know what I'm saying? So there's none of that none of that memorize a gigantic and often nonsensical key map bullshit that we see in many roguelike games, which, in my opinion, makes this game much more approachable for the new player, and I prefer that. Right, now that all that bullshit is out of the way, what are our plans for all of this crap going forward? So, I think the next thing we're going to do is reverse engineer the data files from the various versions that we've got and compare them, particularly the maps. I think it'll be interesting to kind of see if and how the maps evolved over time from the VMS version to the Unix version, what couple of little maps we have in it, to the PC version. And I've actually got all of those already reverse engineered, all the data file formats. I just need to make a video about it, so that won't take too much work, I guess. After that, after we have a video about that, I want to reverse engineer the game mechanics from the extant source code, and I've got that partially complete. Like I said, the source code is absolutely nightmarish. But I think that a general understanding of how the original is supposed to work will be helpful for our re-implementation efforts. I do want to try to make a re-implementation of this game, not an exact work-alike, not a copy of the terrible existing source code, but something that's much more portable. I want to regrade it in ANSI C. There is a C version, but it's such a mess that it's essentially unsalvageable. So I want to rate it in ANSI C. I want to make it all as portable as possible, and at the same time I want to try to keep it fairly modular and extensible, where that doesn't interfere with efficiency too much, because at least initially I also want to make sure that it'll still compile and run on old iron. When I say old iron, what I've got in mind are like 8-bit CPU systems, like the Z80 or the 6502, that could have 64K of RAM and a single floppy drive, and even perhaps not even 80 columns text display. It would be nice if we could have display code that would work on 40 columns for old Apple IIs and Commodore 64s, as well as 64 columns for the older iterations of the TRS-80. But yeah, even though there's the original version that we're looking at wouldn't run on such a system, there isn't any particular reason that I can see that it can't be written to run on such a system. We'll just only be able to simulate one dungeon level at a time, and have to wait on some disk access while moving between levels, instead of loading the entire dungeon map, like every level of the dungeon all at once, into RAM. But we'll talk about that more in later videos. When I talk about extending the game, I do mean extending the game, making it more interesting. As you can see, what's here doesn't really hold up very well in current year, as far as gameplay quality. But if we're only simulating one dungeon level at a time, that'll leave plenty of memory free to make those dungeon levels much more interesting, I think. And the way that the UI is presented and everything, and the kind of the non-tactical way that combat happens and all that stuff. I think it'll make it interesting, kind of as to do kind of quasi story-based stuff with. You know what I'm saying? Like not like read all the words bullshit. You know what I'm saying? But like, you know, something a little deeper than just wander around and kill the monsters and get the experience and loot, so you can kill more monsters and get more experience and loot. You know, kind of get rid of that Skinner box shit and kind of have like kind of a narrative and some puzzles behind it. You know, a lot of the way that these dungeons are designed, especially this particular dungeon, I think would lend themselves well to like sort of a different little theme per level that all culminate in some ultimate theme of the overall dungeon. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, like, we can talk about that later. Just rest assured that I think that we can make the gameplay much more interesting than it is in the existing version. So we're almost finished. If you've gotten this far, I applaud your ability to stay awake in the face of boring bullshit. So next time we'll talk about the data format of the map files and compare them. And that will probably be even more boring than this was for you. So, you know, it'll have to be like that scene in Clockwork Orange. You'll have to hold your eyelids open with toothpicks or something. But in the meantime, you can have yourself a delicious adult beverage and poke through the source code and data that I've collected so far via the Subversion repository, which I'll link in the video description. And additionally, I found the DOS version hosted on a JavaScript-based DOS emulator on the web. That's the one that we see running here. And you can go play that too if you want to. I'll link that in the video below too. This is an older version of the game that still uses the dungeon maps from the VMS version of the game. There's actually the newer version, the Dungeons of the Necromancer's Domain, he called it. Bill Knight called it, rather than just D&D, that's hosted on the Internet Archive. That's a later version that doesn't use the same maps, and I don't think it's as good personally. Yeah, and also for any of you that are coming into the video series later in the future, assuming we have a future and the world doesn't end tonight, I'll try to keep a table of contents of future videos linked up in like a pinned comment or something, or maybe in the video description or some bullshit below. Anyway, I apologize for being boring as fuck. Thank you for joining me. And I'll talk to you gentlemen next time. Have a lovely what's left of the weekend.